All right, everyone. Now the moment you've all been waiting for, World War II. Now I have to say that this lesson is hard for me because I know you're all very interested in this. Every time I teach this class, suddenly everyone begins participating during the World War II section. So I'm sorry that we only have 7 weeks to teach this entire course. You could teach a whole class on World War II and barely scratch the surface. But I'll do my best here. Um, and hopefully you enjoy it. So, what can I say about World War II? It was obviously the biggest, most immense conflict in the history of the world. Roughly 60 million people die. It changed the way people viewed the world, viewed themselves, viewed each other, and it made the world uh, have a different concept of what people were capable of, both for good and not good. So essentially, World War II changed everything. And of course, it all happens because of Hitler. Uh, Hitler was an overall bad guy. Obviously, he was born in Austria, but was of German heritage. Um, Kind of a mystery as to why he hated Jews so much. He was not a rich person, did not come from any prestigious background. Um, Most important thing that I think that you need to know about him was that he rebuilt Germany uh, and reinstated a very strong sense of German nationalism. Um, that's probably why he was so popular, is because he was good at building the German ego. It should be noted that not everyone blindly followed Hitler around and bought into his policies, but he did have a lot of very important and powerful admirers, and he was very popular. Uh, so Hitler comes to power in the 1930s and sets up a fascist government. So, what is fascism? Essentially, fascism is a system of government led by a dictator. But the key characteristic, again, is nationalism. I'm not talking about patriotism. Remember last lesson we talked about nationalism in regards to World War I. Nationalism goes way beyond love of country and embraces cultural and usually racial superiority. It has a few other characteristics like the government regiments all industry and commerce. It's very far right of the political spectrum. It's very militaristic. It opposes all forms of liberalism because they oppose equality, and they oppose equality again because of the nationalist factor, the sense of cultural and racial superiority. And there's also a strong sense of victimization. For example, Hitler was very effective in making Germans feel like they were the victims, especially right after World War One. After World War One, France and Britain imposed these very harsh penalties on Germany as a form of reparations. These penalties were so harsh that, in fact, they helped usher in the Great Depression, because there was no way Germany would be able to pay off what Great Britain and France wanted them to, so their economy uh, falls into shambles. France and Great Britain, that it affects them, it affects Russia, and ultimately it affects the United States. But anyway, Hitler says that these countries have bullied Germany, uh, given them a bad deal, and they're the reason why Germans are struggling so much. He feeds off of German insecurities. So he blames these other countries. He blames the Jews for their for bringing Germany into their financial woes as well. He also calls out Germans, a few elite Germans, for turning their back on German heritage uh, and essentially stabbing Germany in the back. So it's really quite uh, stunning how this nobody, Hitler was genuinely a nobody, came to be one of the most powerful and evil men of the 20th century. Then, of course, we also have Japan. Um, like Germany, they had a fascist government. There were some differences, but essentially they had the same fascist characteristics, a strong sense of nationalism, a sense of victimization, very militaristic, very far right of the political spectrum. So on December 7th, 1941, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. They attack the United States Navy, and that elicits a declaration of war on Japan from the United States. 3 days later, the United States and Germany declare war on each other, and the United States enters World War II. Prior to this, Europe was up in the air. Nobody really knew how that was going to turn out. France had fallen to Germany, which was a huge surprise because France historically had had the most powerful military. So when Germany rolls through Paris, that's pretty shocking to the world, and it leaves Great Britain all alone in defending against Germany. The USSR then enters the war in the middle of 1941, but nobody's really sure what Stalin is capable of, what his intentions are. He's kind of a very unpredictable guy. Um, so, so the fate of Europe is really up in the air. Now, I don't want to diminish the immensity of the war or the sacrifice that the United States made, that Americans made to the war effort, but once the United States enters the war, it's essentially over. Uh, the American economy was so huge and so powerful, despite being in the midst of a depression, that there was no way Japan and Germany and Italy would be able to compete with it. Um, Also, the American political system, despite what many people think, was very, very reliable and stable, unlike these other countries in Europe. Uh, you knew what you were getting with the United States government. And so that stability and that economic superiority essentially uh, made it so that the question of how the war would turn out was no longer in doubt. Um, but there were several other questions, like how long would it take? That was probably the biggest one. How long would it take the United States, Great Britain, and the USSR to end the war? So initially, the United States focuses on Japan. They wage some major battles in the Pacific, trying to push Japan out of its island holdings. The turning point comes during the Battle of Midway, roughly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. And that's not to say they weren't fighting in Europe, but their initial concern was with the Pacific. They didn't really turn their focus to Europe until D-Day, June 6th, 1944, which was a massive Allied offensive against German forces on the shores of France. Probably the largest coordinated battle in history. And from there, it only took them just under a year to push their way all the way through Europe to Berlin and end the war in Europe. Uh, Also, the USSR, Russia, was very instrumental in ending the war. Probably the fiercest fighting was on the Eastern Front between Germany and Russia. And Russia actually reached Berlin before the United States and Great Britain. So it was a very immense but relatively short conflict. Um, at home, also, so the United States gets to Berlin in about April of 1945. Um, Germany surrenders in May, and then a few months later, Truman authorizes the use of the atomic bombs on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war ends. At home, also, there were immense changes happening. Uh, the key mentality among Americans was sacrifice. They believed that nothing they did could compare to the sacrifice that American soldiers were making. And so they really did all they could do to support the war effort. And this was probably the last time uh, we haven't seen anything like this, essentially. Um, since then, the level of unity that Americans had in supporting the war effort has not been seen since then. Um, Probably the most notable event on the home front was the amount of women that entered the workforce. They took up jobs that were traditionally held by men, which changed gender relations and gender dynamics in a lot of different and big ways. And it opened the door for women to take a larger role in how the country was run. Minorities, especially African Americans, were also able to increase their political authority. Many joined the military, and while they're fighting in Europe and the Pacific, they begin to ask questions like, why am I doing this for a country that treats my race like second-class people? Because, obviously segregation is still happening in the South. Lynchings are still all over the place. And so they come home and they begin to be sort of these activists pushing for more rights and freedoms and authority in the American society. Um, Now, also African Americans at home are taking jobs traditionally held by whites, which also increases their opportunities. One group, however, that doesn't fare so well during World War II are Japanese Americans. After Pearl Harbor, the FBI releases a report that says they essentially know who all of the Japanese spies are in the United States, and there's not very many of them. But that does not stop a few very loud and powerful politicians from sort of capitalizing on this and demanding that the Japanese American people be rounded up and put into internment camps. So they get their way, and after 1941, thousands of Japanese Americans are taken from their homes, arrested, and shipped off to these various camps around the American West. And these camps were very, very primitive and run down. They were in the middle of the most inhospitable environments in the United States, deserts, high deserts, very hot, not a lot of cool weather. So it was a very dark time in United States history. And these Japanese, many of them, they lost their homes, they lost their way of life. Japanese Americans lost millions of dollars because of this, because of they're losing their businesses and their jobs. The United States has tried to pay some reparations, but it essentially hasn't come close to the amount that they lost. So, to conclude, World War II changed everything geopolitically and also at home on the home front. And probably, though, the most immense change came from the introduction of the atomic bomb, which we'll talk about next time. So, enjoy the lesson.